to do this training in a hybrid model, which I believe you guys are all very much used to. So Simon is going to be presenting virtually, and I'll be doing parts of it here in person. So I'm going to let Simon take it away and then jump in after he's done.
Yeah, so just to start off, I don't really have any slides containing ground rules or anything like that, but I just want to make sure that you all know that this is a safe space. We're going to be talking about some of the things that might contribute to reasons why we might be biased or prejudiced towards certain groups or things. And so obviously with a conversation like that, sensitive things can get brought up. And so I just ask that we all, listen to each other, not to respond, be respectful to one another. And of course, take everything that we're talking about and internalize it and, take everything that you can learn to try and do better to improving your anti-ableist subconscious, which is what this presentation is all about. And so to start off, before we talk about an anti-ableist bias, we have to talk about what bias is. The literal definition of bias is an inclination toward or against something or someone. And so to demonstrate this, I want to just pose a really easy question to you all. So when I say peanut butter, what do you all think of? Someone want to raise their hand and say the first thing that comes to mind when you hear peanut butter? Jelly, yes, of course. A pinnacle of many American lunches is a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So because of this, we frequently associate peanut butter with jelly and vice versa. So is there anything else that you all can think of that goes well with peanut butter? Maybe not the first thing. Chocolate, yes, exactly. So jelly is the first thing that we think of. And so the thing is that when we say that jelly is the first thing that comes with peanut butter, that's kind of reflecting our implicit bias. Growing up, again, we've associated commonly jelly with peanut butter. Not that chocolate doesn't go with peanut butter, but more common than not, we say that jelly goes with peanut butter. So that's our subconscious bias. But now I want you all to think about what tastes better with peanut butter. And so let's just do a quick raise of hands. I can't see the room right now, but that's totally okay. Maybe you can just do a quick count for me. How many people think peanut butter goes better with jelly?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh my gosh, there is an
overwhelming
majority for chocolate here.
Yeah, so go ahead. If everyone else, if you feel like chocolate goes better with peanut butter, raise your hand. Now keep your hand raised. Yeah, so keep your hand raised if on the first slide, the first thing you thought of was jelly, but then on this slide, your answer was chocolate. Keep your hand raised. How many hands stayed raised, Deij?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 hands are raised. Okay, so the thing is that it might not necessarily feel like this because this is something super minor like peanut butter and jelly, but really what's happening is you are experiencing a mild cognitive dissonance because what's happening is that your explicit bias for chocolate with peanut butter goes against your implicit bias for what you would normally associate with peanut butter, which is jelly. And this is something that frequently happens in people that live in a society where our true preference or inclination towards something may not match the preference or inclination that society shows towards that thing. And so as a result, sometimes we can inexplicably behave or think in a way that goes against what we truly believe or vice versa, which is that what we truly believe or feel isn't always being demonstrated in our thoughts or behaviors like we think it is. And so just to go dive into this topic a little bit more, I have a little poll everywhere. There should be the link available on Canvas, but you can also scan this QR code or text my first and last name with the digits 424 to the phone number 22333. And this is just going to be a really quick, what's one word you can think of to describe why should Lens students care about implicit bias? And then let me just go, I have to activate the activity really quick. So let me just do that. And then you all will be able to give your responses. Okay, the activity should be active. I'm going to share my screen so that we can see stuff as it comes in. And I hope the people who are participating virtually are also able to see and hear well and are able to contribute via chat to any of these discussions.
Yeah.
I like the theme that's emerging.
Yes, I do too. All right, so does someone in the audience want to raise their hand and tell me what they're seeing in these responses? What's coming up?
What strikes you guys first? Patience, yeah. Say that again, sorry, I didn't hear. Yeah. What else? Do you have your hand up?
Impact.
Impact. Mm-hmm. Perspective, yeah.
Yeah.
Any of the virtual audience, if you guys want to jump in on the chat with what you see, that would be great.
Feel free to just come off mute as well, whichever is easier.
Yes, or unmute. Okay. Equity. I really like how patient continues to remain kind of front and center. And I also love how it kept switching for the most time between impacts and patients. Those were the two that kind of kept going back and forth. And I really love that. I think those are very crucial.
Yes, absolutely. Across disciplines, no matter, if it's audiology, developmental behavioral pediatrics, psychology, whatever it is, obviously implicit bias that we hold as providers impacts our patients. And then like Maddie said, also the work that we do too. So not even just with patients, but even like, the type of research that we might be interested in doing, the way that we interact with our colleagues, so on and so forth. I mean, it bleeds into so many different dimensions of things that we do in the hospital. So thank you all for participating in that. And so I'm going to ask you to do one more. And so I will stop sharing my screen and I'm going to bring up another one. And so this one is just asking you guys, and this is more of a free response. Why should you care about implicit bias in your discipline? Think of some examples of things of where implicit bias might affect something that you do in your job. So I'm going to do the same thing. Let's see, present. And it should be like the same phone number, same all that kind of stuff. But let me know if you guys have any issues with getting it up.
Yeah, just one word.
Timely diagnosis. Yes, that is a huge one. Misdiagnosis. Yes.
Love that, Melanie.
Mm-hmm.
Jumping to conclusions.
Yeah.
You guys have some great responses.
Yes.
Passing the floor. That's one. Recommendations given. Community.
Okay, I feel like we got a good number of responses. So I guess I'll go ahead and talk about some of the ones that caught my eye, and then you can share afterwards too if there's anything that I missed. I think for me, what you all did a really great job of doing is that in the slide before, we kind of touch on the surface level. Well, it impacts the patients and the families and the work that we do. But these are some really great examples of, for example, misdiagnosis or later diagnosis, we know, I mean, we've talked about this in our classes where, for example, with autism spectrum disorder, we see Black and brown children being diagnosed at a later age compared to their white peers, largely due to a bias that is held towards these groups by providers, for example, assuming like just certain behavioral expectations for kids that are Black and brown compared to white kids, and letting that inform what type of diagnostic or even treatment recommendations get made for these families. And I also love the call that you all made to the consequences of these types of issues, which is that it creates harm and mistrust in these communities, and it makes them maybe not want to utilize our services as much. And largely, when you get a diagnosis of autism or any other type of intellectual or developmental disability, the expectation is that you go to a hospital care center in order to get treatment and follow up and all this type of thing. But when you have really bad interactions or issues with these institutions, again, that's where health disparities arise and all these type of issues get created. Neej, is there anything that you saw that you want to call attention to?
Yeah, I also like that some of you called out the whole the cultural context, because I think there is so much variation in even in universally recognized, symptoms and disorders and things like that. The context matters so much. And so how behavior is perceived, how what is considered a priority for intervention or treatment for the same condition, it all varies so much from one culture to another, and what a culture believes is important to them may not look the same for somebody from a different cultural context, right? And so I think it's really important to recognize that what our implicit biases are is going to also influence. Somebody else brought up, what is it going to influence the quality of care that I provide for this family? Is it going to affect the quality of, if I'm going into a patient session already with a preconceived notion about the group that I'm going to serve, then it's going to be really hard for me to remove that lens and not interpret any and all behaviors that I see through that bias lens. And so that directly impacts not just the clinical care that we provide, but it does impact the trust that we have. And what it also impacts is the expectations we have for this particular child's treatment or prognosis, right? And so if I'm going to go in with a biased opinion about a particular family that I'm serving, assuming that, oh, they are X, Y, and Z, so that's all I'm going to expect from them out of treatment, then how much of myself and my capabilities am I going to invest in that particular family? So it does have a huge impact. So I really appreciate you guys bringing up some of those more nuanced things as well.
Yeah. Before we move on to the next slide, does anyone else want to share some of their comments or things that they've noticed from what we've already talked about so far? Any questions? Also in the Zoom land as well, if anyone has any comments, questions, or things they'd like to add.
This is Melanie Youngblood. In our community, we have a fairly homogeneous community with one heterogeneous group of individuals of a different culture, and there's a much higher rate of referral to Department of Human Services for things that are probably not medical neglect or child abuse, but are culturally based differences in child rearing. And it's really unfortunate and tragic.
Yes. Did anyone hear about the recent case in the news at Johns Hopkins and what happened to that mother when they withheld her kid? I mean, it's just stuff like that, like you said, Melanie, too. Like there is a lot of those type of referrals that are made, or like you put in the chat before, jumping to conclusions made by providers, and it leads to these really, really unfortunate situations like you're describing. Largely affecting, Black and brown families, but of course families of all kinds of marginalized backgrounds too.
Have you guys, are you guys familiar with the book, When the Spirit Catches You, You Fall Down, about the Hmong culture? If not, I would highly recommend that book. It is a wonderful book. It's called When the Spirit Catches You, You Fall Down, and it's about the conflict between the Hmong culture in California and a family whose child gets really sick and their interactions with the Western medical system there and the conflicts and all of the things that were brought to the table by the family that were consistently rejected by the medical providers and what kind of a dissonance that caused, as well as what Melanie was saying, you know, those unnecessary referrals and things like that. It's a really, really salient book for this topic, and I would recommend that.
I had to read that book in undergrad, and I would also highly recommend it and second that recommendation. Each. Anyone else? Any comments, questions, or
Any
things
other
before we move on?
thoughts? Yeah. Okay.
No. Okay, I will go ahead and pull back the slides.
So I think next we're going to jump into an activity, aren't we, Simon?
Yes.
All right. Who has taken the IAT before? Any kind of the IAT? There are a bunch of them. Okay, a good number of you have taken the IATs before. Anybody want to volunteer? Like which ones you've taken before? The ones that you're familiar with? You remember which ones you took? Yeah.
I've taken the like white, black.
The race-based one?
Race-based one.
Yeah.
And then maybe, is there a gender-based one?
I think there's a gender-based one, there's a disability-based one, yep. So the implicit association test, or the IAT, what it does, it's a test that was developed by Harvard University, and there is what it does is it measures the strength of association between two different concepts, like, you know, if it's like, you know, whether it's gender identity or it's like Black people or gay people, and, you know, and the evaluations that we implicitly have of certain groups, of whether they are good or bad, or whether they are, you know, whether it conforms to certain stereotypes we might have about that group, you know, they're clumsy or they are athletic, things like that. And so the main idea behind the IAT is that making a response is easier when closely related items share the same response key. So you will see as you take the test that it's going to require of you to respond in a certain way. So you have to follow instructions and respond the way that they ask you to respond. And in the middle of the test, the instructions change. So you have to kind of pay attention to that as well. Next slide. So why do we use the IAT? It's essentially the main purpose of the IAT is to raise awareness, right? So it's kind of it's important for us to remember that it's not a diagnostic test by any means. It's not an assessment or an accurate representation of where your biases are or what kind of biases you hold. So it's not a character judgment of any kind. So what it does, it's really simply just a test that we take to raise our own awareness of, oh, I didn't realize that that might have been a bias that I was holding, right? So it's very much like, and it's important to remember that a bias by nature is dynamic. It doesn't stay stagnant. Some biases stay stagnant, but most often than not, for most of us, our biases evolve with time, right? And all of us have implicit biases, right? And so Simon and I often like to say this quote that we heard one of our wonderful speakers said on the topic, you know, who has implicit bias? The only two requirements for having implicit bias is if you have a brain and if you live in society. If you meet these two criteria, you have implicit bias. Because implicit bias is just that, it's implicit. It's something that's a function and a product of our learnings over time, our exposures to different outlets and groups and media over time. It's just a product of living in society and the messages that we get bombarded with. So it's rarely ever stagnant, right? And so just like you go to the doctor and you take your blood pressure today, it might look different and than what it might be 2 weeks later or 2 weeks prior. Results from the IAT is going to be like that. You take it today, you might get a particular outcome. You take it in a few weeks or a year or two, it's going to probably look different. So that part is, again, pretty standard. So it also depends on, you know, in what state of mind you are in when you're taking the IAT, what happened prior to you coming to this class today. All of these things are going to make an, you know, have an impact on it. So don't overthink your responses. It's important that you take it quickly, you respond instinctively to these to the prompts, and then doing it as quickly as you can without feeling worry or anxiety about what the result could be at the end of it. And so what we are really trying to do is simply just raise our own awareness, take the temperature of where we are at, and then maybe thinking about, okay, what are some influences that we need to identify, what might have led to some of the implicit biases that we have. That's where the work lies, is really kind of then talking about, okay, what are the things that have happened in my life or my lived experiences that may have contributed to this bias that I hold. And then we work from there, right? And so it is important, the disclaimer we would like to give is that when we all finish taking the IAT and look at those results, sometimes it can feel distressing to us, right? Because all at the heart of it, we're all good people, right? Most of us are, at least in this room, right? Like at the heart of it, we want to do the right thing. We want to be kind. We want to be inclusive. The very fact that you're all here engaged in this activity and in this class tells us a lot about where your heart lies and what your investment is in. And so a lot of that, but that doesn't negate any of us or protect any of us from coming face to face with some of the implicit biases that we have. And so it can be distressing, but again, like I said, this is not a character judgment or set in stone and something that will never change. So it's just important for us to kind of take it in the spirit as well. Okay, any questions? Again, the only thing we would like to stress is really don't overthink your responses, and there is no right response to this, right? So just go ahead and take it as quickly as you can, all right? Okay, so I think today's test, like I said, the IAT, there is a variety. You guys are welcome to go to the website and take as many of them as you want, you know, on a light weekend if you want something light to do. But today we are going to focus on physical disability. And so what you're going to do is, I think, Simon, do they have this open?
So I put the link in Canvas, and then I can also make sure to
Do you guys have the
put it in
access
Zoom
to
chat.
the link? Okay. If you have the link, go ahead and click on the link. And then when you get to the link, and I hope the folks in Zoom land are also doing this simultaneously along with us right now, you are going to use keep skipping ahead until you get to this page. Is that right, Simon?
Yeah, so basically the idea is that when you go to the web page, you'll scroll down to the bottom and it says, I wish to proceed. You will click that. You will get a list of all the different IATs that they offer. You're going to scroll down to the bottom and you're going to want to pick the disability IAT. And then from there, you'll hit continue. It will ask you to enter your birth month and your birth year and month. And then after that, there will be some demographic information that they might ask you to put forth. You don't have to. There should be a decline to answer option in the corner. So you can either answer them or just hit skip, 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 skip until you get to the end. I will say that for time's sake, it probably would be better for us to just hit decline and get straight to the IAT. But again, if you want to do it, answer all the demographic stuff quickly, that's fine. I think the idea is that right now we're sitting at 3:25. I want to make sure everyone has plenty of time to take the IAT. So maybe we give 20 minutes until 3:45 to make sure everyone has time to take it and process their results and get access to them. And then at 3:45 to 4 o'clock, we'll reserve that time for discussion. And so this is where, Deij, if you're willing to do it with a large group in the room, I'll go off in Zoom and do the breakout room with everyone attending virtually for 15 minutes after that. And we'll all reconvene at 4 o'clock and maybe spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about as a large group the things that we learned and discussed.
Any questions? All right, so you guys can go ahead and get started.
So yeah, Sarah, whenever you're ready, you have put us in a breakout room and just return us at 4 o'clock.
It's getting close to being done. 15 minutes left. Anyone still taking it? Minutes. feeling about that? Right. All right. I think everybody is done, so we can get started. So anybody want to volunteer? What were your first thoughts or feelings or reactions that you got after you received your result, that you had after you received your results? And it's totally up to you guys whether you want to share specifics of the results you received or you just want to kind of speak in generalities. The actual result really doesn't matter at all. It's more, I'd like to focus on what your thoughts were about the results you got. Yes.
I've taken the test before. Do we need the mic? Oh, I guess not.
I don't think so.
Because we're not hearing it.
We're in a.
Yeah.
I've taken it before and like I was telling you that I get very stressed out over it because I'm like trying to remember in my mind, like, which one do I push for which? And I'm like, good, this one, bad, this one, like disable this one, like able this one, and it stresses me out a lot to do this test. So
Yes.
my response or my results were moderate automatic preference for physically able people over physically disabled people. Well, I don't want to be like, yeah, that's 100% accurate. You know, I always want to be like, yeah, I'm really cool with everybody. I think just based like societal things that are put in place, like, and how this is associated, you're just like ingrained that it's not necessarily to be like good and bad, but like these words that pop up are like, you know, like happy and like this impression that individuals with disability with their families are not happy, they're like under all this stress, they can't live a fulfilling life. And so I think that's kind of what gets ingrained where you're associating some of these words with what that is. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Sarah.
People do not say the songs. More with disabled people a lot. Like we love them. We're right now. So I'm thinking, too bad for Joe, I guess, right? Yeah, exactly. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, it's a mixed bag, right? Like the process of taking the test itself is stressful, and then the results you get are just sometimes you're like, what? Like I had a similar experience when I did the race-based test. It showed that I had a strong preference for people who are white than people who are Asian. And I'm like, no, that's not true. So yes, so it definitely, and we'll come back to that. Like we'll come back to what might be behind some of those things as well. But thank you guys for sharing. So anybody else want to share? Yeah, go ahead.
Different bias because growing up, I've always been told that the right hand is for good. And
Yeah,
left hand is for bad.
yeah,
When you take like
yes,
the day
offering,
of
yeah,
it,
yeah.
you have to put your right hand first. So when bad was right and a good was left, it was so difficult for me to rewire that and do it. And that's why I feel I got a moderate bias because it was so difficult for me to think that right is good, right is bad.
Yes.
And I didn't say it.
Yes, yes. Thank you for bringing that up. And I agree. Like, I don't think I've thought about that before. I mean, I grew up and I'm assuming you're from India. Is that right? Yes, I grew up in India too. And right is good and left is bad for various reasons. We eat with our right hand because if we eat with our fingers, we are eating with our right hand. Like all of our majority things are happening in our right. And so that's something else that could be influencing just the response selection. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? Yep.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Also, I feel like it was a really big mix up when it at first was like bad and good, and then it switched to good and bad. And I was like I was thinking more about it the second time because it wasn't what was first taught. I just wanted to do what I originally had done. And so I feel like the results could have been skewed a little bit for like those purposes too, because I had to think more about it because it wasn't what was originally the way it was, if that makes sense.
Yes, you have to now think in a different way to answer in a way that
Which isn't,
doesn't
like,
feel.
the pathway that like
intuitive,
my
yeah.
brain thought of originally, so
Yeah.
that was tripping me up, but
Yeah. Yeah, shifting perspectives is not easy, right? Like that
Yeah.
definitely has an impact. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
I also want to speak to that because the only one that I kept getting like tripped up on was grief.
Mhm.
Because I like say a lot to my clients, like grief is a good thing, it's okay. And since you're like, you know what, you're going through this process. So when like grief was associated with bad, I kept pushing good. And it's like, no, it's bad. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, not bad. So I think that also kind of screwed up with me because that was the one I kept getting next one.
Yeah, that's a great perspective as well. Thank you. Yes.
This is related, but not exactly, like on the handness.
Yeah.
I'm left-handed, because I think that like being able to switch like between left and right hand is a lot easier for me. A lot of things are right-handed, so like having to do that, I think makes it a little bit easier for me to like switch tasks, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I don't associate things in that way, but
Yeah. It is absolutely. Who else would like to share? Yes, go ahead.
I think one thing I noticed when I was taking it was when the like last two, when they're switched, I was kind of disappointed in myself because I've been working on like the implicit bias, and it was kind of like there were points if I was going faster where I'd like associate that with like physically disabled. And I'm like, oh, why did I do that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh. So I did notice that goal of like it does take some effort
Yeah.
to notice the implicit bias and switch it back over. And even if you've been working on it for years, it's still something that
Yes.
that was something I reflected on.
Absolutely. You're supposed to do the reflecting after you get the results, not before as you're working through it. No, I'm just joking. Yes, go ahead.
I don't know if they've done this, but do you know if the test has been like reversed before to see if there's different results? Like wondering if like since it was like muscle memory or muscle memory.
Yeah.
If the test results were.
Yeah, I know. I don't know the psychometrics of the test, right? Like, but I know that this is one of the most extensively kind of studied and used tests for all of this. And so I think there has been, because, questions like, oh, I wonder how much of the developers' implicit biases played an effect into how these questions are designed or how the prompts are given and things like that. I know that there is literature out there about that. I'm not too familiar with it, but I know that they have kind of figured it out in every which way to kind of come to the product that we have today. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the things about the test is a lot of times, when we think about raising awareness with the IAT, I think the results in itself is one thing, right? Like, again, as people who are in the field that we are in, doing the work that we do, I think we already have our own implicit biases about certain things like ableism, racism, equity, inclusion, all of that, right? Good or bad. I think we are more skilled test takers, especially when it comes to the IAT, I think, but it still kind of surprises you when you get results that you're like, what? I wasn't expecting that. that's one part of it. The second part of it is I also like that it raises questions during the test taking process itself. Like it helps us to kind of think about like, oh, wait, but this is the perspective I've always had, that right is better than left. And so right automatically has to be good and left has to be bad. Like it really helps us to at least think about things like, oh, wait, even if the broader concept, it is harder to change perspective. I'm used to something in a certain way because that's what I grew up learning. And now I have to take a completely different perspective, and that's going to take a little bit of work. Or to your point, of like reflecting as you're doing, you're like, I know what I think, but then my hand automatically goes there for whatever reason it might be. It makes us pause and think. And so in that sense, it is a helpful tool to kind of, get us thinking a little bit and reflecting a little bit. And I can guarantee you that if you guys take the test, same test, 2 weeks later, it's probably going to look quite different, right? And that's normative too. That's not necessarily that unusual. So based on the results you've gotten, not so much the process of taking the test, or maybe you could weigh in on that too. What might, how do you think your life experiences may have played a role in some of the results that you've gotten today, or the biases that you've worked hard against or have been surprised to learn that you hold? What life experiences do you think may have contributed to that?
I think for me, I've been doing social work for a while, or at least like social services for a long time. So I've been taking these tests periodically, like ever since undergrad a long time ago.
Yeah.
So being like mindful and kind of like remembering back on like how far I've gotten from the first time I took this test has been helpful.
Yeah.
And then I also think like when I saw my results, I used to get really upset with myself with my results, but like over time I've learned to give myself grace and like just take it as this is something I need to work on and be mindful of.
Yeah.
So I think like reflecting on my results instead of getting upset about what I got, it was more like, I don't think I favor one over the other. I think it's more that I get in my head too much and I get so worried I'm gonna say something to offend someone.
Yep.
So I kind of pull back. It's not favoring, it's just like trying to be correct.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like I second that. Like I have taken this one before too, and I feel like I personally have like come a long way, like especially in like the last decade probably. And now more so that like my full-time job is in like developmental physical therapy. So like my whole job is like helping those with developmental and physical disabilities.
Yeah.
And so, but when I grew up in a primarily like white, off like neighborhood, and I went to private school for my entire education.
Yeah.
So I feel like my like worldview was really limited before I like honestly probably before I got to college. And that's when like all the things kind of came into like a more clear picture of things that I needed to work on versus like things that like felt ingrained or like implicit at that point.
Yep, absolutely. And that's an interesting point, because in those situations, there is also that push and pull between what you grew up with, a set of experiences, and that was normative at that point in time. And then the experiences that you're currently in, whether through choice or through happenstance, this has become normative. And so there is that, how do you just kind of reflecting on the fact that, okay, there is constant evolution and growth. When we choose to pay attention to this, there is a lot that we can do.
I think every day there's so many tabs in India where I grew up. The concept of physical disability, intellectual disability is there's a lot of taboo around it.
Yeah.
And the general consensus is there's limited potential for growth in life when there's a certain disability associated with an individual. And I think over here, looking at different examples or how much it's being discussed and how normally it's being discussed and how normally it's being accepted, that's something that's challenging the perspectives that I grew up with, or the perspectives of everyone back home, or how society in my country looked at certain things and how it's looked at outside my country.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that cultural context and so it's not necessarily always good or bad, it's just what it is. And it definitely takes some mindset. It taking things for what it is okay. I think there is value to saying that, okay, I see where this is coming from. When it starts to become an issue would probably be when, okay, but is that perspective actively harming or hindering somebody else's right to live an equitable life, right? And that's where the questions become more challenging, and those perspective needs to be challenged more. But absolutely, it definitely is a perspective switch. Absolutely. Anybody else? Yeah.
Related to that, with some of the other comments too, the influence of media representations on.
Yes.
Because our media has such a lack of like positive or even like neutral representation.
Yes.
In just all types of media, so I feel like that's just like a really large scale way that implicit bias
100%.
is spread.
100%, yes. And I think there is also with regard to ableism in particular, I mean, we are surrounded by it, aren't we? Like, I think it's just, there is just so much. And even, you know, even the whole, you know, it's not just like, oh, if it's a physical or an intellectual or a developmental disability, there is one large section of society, I think across cultures, where there is a negative connotation to it, or where there is that limiting of the potential, or like thinking about like, okay, how much more can they do? But then the other extreme for it is the glorification of even the, you know, there is a pendulum almost swings between either feeling sympathy and sorry for somebody with a disability to marveling at day-to-day things that they do, that, you know, that only reason that they are glorified in that instance is because of that disability, right? That you wouldn't tell anybody else, oh, you're so brave to come into work every day, right? Like, I mean, I think that applies regardless, depending on where you work. But I think that really thinking about like how deeply ingrained that message is for so many of us in society across media, you know, conversations, family conversations, societal conversations, how much we are just exposed to that constantly on a day-to-day basis. Absolutely. Really quickly, before we jump back to the larger group, what would you do differently now that you know today's version of your IAT results on this? Like, is there something differently that you would do based on the knowledge that you have from the IAT? Anything that gave you pause and you're like, huh, okay, that's something that I might need to continue peeling back further or working on further? Yeah.
One thing that I very much struggle with in my role is other staff that I work with.
Mm-hmm.
And their bias and response. I work only with patients with disabilities and
Yes.
many with challenging behaviors. And they see me and it's like, oh my God, what's going on? Like,
Yeah.
just see me, and it frustrates me so much.
Yeah.
Working with other staff.
Yeah.
And there are many times that I will avoid. I'm like, oh, let's find someone else for this patient to see versus
Yes.
this person seeing it, because I don't want to cause harm to the patient and family based on that person's response and how they might treat this patient and family, because they will treat them
Differently, yeah.
And then the flip side of like me learning of like having those conversations and doing some teaching and reminding them like they're a person, like they're just like anybody else. They have a disability, but these are ways that we can support them and how you can help them while they're here.
Right.
So for me, it's like kind of balancing that my frustration and anger with staff of how they're responding versus using that as a moment that I can hopefully maybe not change their minds, but kind of chip away at some of those experiences and that other staff have. And so that's kind of where I'm trying to tailor my focus, but it's definitely hard to not get angry and mad at other people.
Yes. It's a particular kind of frustration when you experience any of the isms from a colleague or somebody that you work with or somebody that is in the same field as you technically, and you're like, you should know better, you should do better, right? And that speaks to, again, just how pervasive this is and how it is being in a certain position or holding a certain degree or working with a certain population does not exclude any of us from holding implicit biases. And the only thing that we can do is consistently work on counteracting them and addressing them and reflecting on them so that we can continue, because it is a work in progress when it comes to addressing implicit biases. Yeah.
I was just gonna add, I've never taken one of these before.
Yeah.
I have no idea that they existed.
Yeah.
And I don't agree, this is like, I don't know that there's much to take away, I think I probably could have slowed down and taken it, but I would be curious to try like a different thing. I think this
Yes.
is for me because my son's 24.
Yep.
And I would say maybe I had more of an implicit bias
Yep.
30 years ago, but I'm 55, and so I'm surrounded by people. I mean, I love them, and
Yep.
I volunteer and care and do a lot of work. So I think this particular one I didn't agree with. But I would
Yes.
be curious to take another one because I think the results might be more telling to me.
Yeah, yeah, I would encourage everybody to do that. I think there are also, many of us also take these tests kind of I do, at least for confirmation purposes, right? Like, let me make sure, like, this is what I think, and I'm gonna take this test to see whether I have a confirmation bias, like just for the confirmation bias perspective, and then it's gut wrenching when that doesn't happen and you don't get that confirmation. But I think that, so there are topics even within the IAT or tests that we go in with a certain bias for what we would expect the results to turn out. So it might be actually kind of fun and telling to take something that you have no awareness of and just go blind into it and say, let me see what this looks like for me now. I think that would be helpful. Yes, Sarah. Yeah. Yeah.
I love them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
Together.
yeah.
Yeah.
This one didn't apply.
Yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't make sense, right? Like a lot of times you're just like, okay, this makes no sense. And that could be very well that, yeah, some of those results just sometimes don't make sense. And it probably, again, like we said, like it is not definitely a reflection of, oh, this is the deep, dark secret you're holding inside your heart that is now revealed in the implicit bias test. That's definitely not the case at all. But it is still, and again, even just the variability of when you take the test and the results being impacted by that speaks a lot to how this is just much more of that raising awareness or kind of, let me think about what could have led to. So it may not, while it might not be a correlation versus and causation kind of a thing at all, but it might be even in situations where the results obviously just don't make sense, to maybe think about like, okay, it's nothing that I feel, but like, is there anything that in all of my life growing up or situations I've been exposed to, messages I've heard that I worked hard against to overcome, could those have impacted, or could those have played a role in how just automatically my brain is wired in certain ways? And that doesn't take away from the constant work we are doing to overcome that. Yes.
I think I had similar results to Julie and Sarah, and I have a sister who has Down syndrome.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just kind of funny, but also it makes sense in a way, because I think that for us three, all of like our lives, or then Julie, all of, Joe's life, that, you hear like the bad things.
Yeah.
And so maybe subconsciously you're so overly aware of like the things that are bad, that subconsciously you do have this bias, even though that's not actually what you do.
Correct. Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, good points. Let me check in with Simon real quick to see if they are back, and that way we can have a larger group discussion before we jump into the next couple of things.
Yeah.
Simon, are you here?
I am. I do think for the
Okay.
sake of time, it might be a little bit hard to do like a full large group discussion, but Mary, did you want to go ahead and report out just some of the key takeaways that our group talk about?
Yes. So we kind of had a mix of results and feelings about those results. Some of us were not very surprised because we've taken this before, and others had never taken it and did like better or worse than they expected. For the second one, some life experiences. We talked about the portrayal of disability in the media that we were exposed to growing up and also now, and just how that portrayal can be kind of stereotyped and just have like negative connotations surrounding it. We also talked about our experiences growing up and maybe not having a lot of exposure to people with disabilities or people who are different from us. So like personally, I went to a Catholic school, so I wasn't around, kids with disabilities until like out of high school, basically. And then lastly, just thinking about like when we're growing up, like the things people say to us or like the little snippets we hear from other people around us, like you really take that in and that kind of just like settles, and kind of form those biases. And then for the last one, what we might do now that we know our results, we talked about kind of like challenging those automatic thoughts that we have that are associated with our automatic biases. And instead of like having a negative thought and just moving on or saying like, oh, that's just what I think, kind of challenging, like, why am I thinking that? And like reframing it in a different way.
Thank you, Mary. That was very well put. Anybody from here wants to quickly summarize for our virtual participants? Any bullet point version of it anybody wants to share? All right, I'm guessing no. Well, I think just to summarize, I think we touched upon similar themes as well, and just kind of how much we are using these questions to reflect and continually kind of challenge and question or just kind of reflect upon what may have led to the results that they did, but also kind of thinking through what are some how perspective shifting can be hard even just from the process of taking this test. All right, so moving on to the next step. So what can we do to reduce our implicit biases? We would like to focus the rest of our session today on just kind of talking through some strategies. So what we're going to do is we are deriving or we are using Patricia Devine and her colleagues' work on prejudice habit breaking. And this is an intervention that she has talked about with her colleagues where she identifies where they identify 5 different steps to reduce implicit biases. So there is stereotype replacement, counter stereotypic imaging, individuation, perspective taking, and increasing opportunities for contact. And although these strategies were specifically developed to reduce racial biases, they can very well be applied for ableism and reducing biases with for people with disabilities and other groups marginalized by society as well. All right. So the first one that we're going to talk about is stereotype replacement. And as it's, explains, it involves replacing stereotypical responses that we may have about a group, about an individual belonging to a certain group with non-stereotypical responses. And what is really key to thinking about, to do when we are implementing this particular strategy, stereotype replacement, is it's important for us to slow down. It's important for us to avoid snap judgments, that oftentimes lead to those stereotypical assumptions that we make, and remove any discretion or ambiguity from the decision-making process. And so we also use this strategy to address personal stereotyping, and which reflects a lot, which requires a lot of reflection, right? So it's important for us to think about, wait, this is something that's coming from an assumption that I'm making or a stereotype I'm making based on a bias I hold about a certain group of people. And so what can I do now, or why did this response occur in the first place, before coming up with what is a strategy I can use to replace this response with another more neutral response. So these are some self-reflection kind of questions that you can ask to replace a stereotypical response, including something like, what assumptions have I made about the person's capabilities or limitations because of their disability? In our group, we talked quite a lot about physical or intellectual or developmental disabilities. Society as a whole places limitations for what is considered achievable progress, right, or potential. And so what can we do? How have some of those messages that we've gotten from our society for years and years and years, how has that influenced the assumptions we've made about this person's capability or their limitations because of the disability that they have? And then really thinking about and reflecting upon what evidence do I have? We are all in fields of work that requires us to think critically and use evidence-based practices. So very similar to that, what evidence do I have that supports the conclusion that I have drawn? And how have I challenged some of those assumptions that I have that didn't seem to quite make sense, where there has been a dissonance? And so are there any other kind of self-reflection questions you think you can use for the stereotype replacement strategy? Anybody else think of one? All right, anybody in the virtual world with an idea for a stereotypical response replacement? All right, before we move on to the next strategy, these suggested self-reflection questions, they arrived at this from the Courts Catalyzing Change bench card checklist for judges. So they used that bench card to come up with some of these self-reflection questions. And that report, the bench card report, was work that was done from a national initiative, which is Courts Catalyzing Change, Achieving Equity and Fairness in Foster Care. And so it details both positive qualitative and quantitative results when judges who were making decisions about placement of children who've been in abused or other neglect-facing homes in foster care system, when they follow a set of these decision-making guidelines, the outcome was more quantitatively and qualitatively more positive. And so the authors here have used that as their framework for coming up with these self-reflection questions. All right.
Yeah, so the next one we're going to talk about is counter-stereotypic imaging. So the idea with this one is you want to make positive examples that you have in your head salient and accessible, so that whenever you encounter a stereotype, you can think to yourself, well, this person isn't necessarily, like this one person isn't necessarily what all people from this group are like, because I can also think of positive stereotypes of this group or people in my head. So for example, these images can be abstract. So for example, if you see some type of thing about disabled people not being able to become a doctor or a teacher, you can think to yourself, well, it's very easy to picture that. More so what's happening is that there are barriers placed by society that is preventing these people from achieving the things that they're wanting to set out to do. Next up is some famous examples. So we'll talk about Frida Kahlo later, but I will stick with Harriet Tubman for a second. Does anyone know that Harriet Tubman was a disabled woman? And if so, how did she come about acquiring her disability, or what is her disability? Does anyone know about the story behind that and would want to share?
There's a lot of no in this group.
Okay.
Simon, I don't know about the virtual.
Hey, last time we did this, someone actually.
Wait, hold on.
Okay.
There's a hand up.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so somebody said it. I think she had like neurocognitive. I think she had like head trauma. And I think she had I think it was like a form of narcolepsy, or she would just like fall asleep randomly. Yeah, I think that's it.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah. Is that right, Simon?
So pretty much, yeah. So what happened is that there was a I think it was either a slave owner or just some white guy who basically she this white guy threw a weight at her head, and it struck her head, and it didn't kill her. But what happened was, is as a result of the weight hitting her head, she ended up having like narcolepsy, seizures, headaches, visions, all kinds of neurocognitive issues that would, what we would consider today under the umbrella of a cognitive disability or acquired disability from the result of the incident, or a TBI, so to speak. So the thing is that whenever we talk about Harriet Tubman, no one ever mentions the fact that she was disabled. Hardly ever do I hear people mention that fact. I mean, what this woman did, leading so many people over to freedom through the Underground Railroad and these other ways. And when you add the layer of the fact that she was going through all this stuff too, I mean, if you read her diary, she talks about having visions of like with Jesus or Christian imagery and things like that whenever she would have her seizures or these out-of-body sensations. In one vision, she talks about how she felt like she was able to fly like a bird. And so again, like, these are things that did happen to Harriet, but no one ever really talks about. And the reason it's important to talk about is, you know, for example, one of the things that Harriet Tubman did other than lead slaves to freedom was that she also worked as a scout and a spy for Union forces during the Civil War. And so I want everyone to think to themselves, if someone had a TBI, a traumatic brain injury, like Harriet Tubman right now, and tried to enlist in the Army, would they be let in? No, they probably would not. I'm not trying to make a case that disabled people should be let into the Army. I'm just saying that the really powerful example of Harriet is that she transcends many expectations that were held against her at the time regarding to her gender, her race, and clearly also her disability status. And so whenever you try to think of what disabled people are capable of, what they can and can't do, I always like to think of people like Frida Kahlo and Harriet Tubman as examples, because there are some very strong historical figures that we talk about in our society, but their disability identity often gets overlooked. So by associating the disability identity with people like Harriet Tubman, it brings more of a positive connotation that I think, like I've already said, gets kind of overlooked. The last example of a counter stereotypic imaging would be someone non-famous. So just anyone who you personally know that might be disabled that you can point to whenever there is a bad connotation about disabled people. You could say, hey, like, that's not true. I know so-and-so and they're not like that, or blah, blah, blah. It's not as, you know, like, for them, their disability is not tragic. It's something that is just a part of their life. They have so many other identities that make up who they are. That's not something they're always working to overcome. It just kind of is what it is, compared to the opposite that is usually what is portrayed, which is that people with disability, that's a tragedy in their life, and that's something they have to work through and get over.
I think one caveat for this is that, so you have to be really mindful about, yes, we want to use counter stereotypic imaging where you're making, positive exemplars salient. You're making sure that you're highlighting the other, the narrative that goes contradictory to what the popular or the predominant narrative is about any particular group of people, while at the same time also being mindful that that doesn't immediately get layered with our implicit biases or any isms, right? So, for example, again, the glorification we talked about earlier, like, having assumptions of, oh, she was really, something, Harriet Tubman, by all accounts and means, like, she is somebody to be absolutely revered and admired, but then we want to make sure that we don't layer it with some kind of a prejudiced statement, like, well, for someone with a disability or someone who is Black, like, she was really, such a go-getter, right? And so that's where, like, we really need to be careful about that, right? Like, when we start thinking of them as exceptions to the norm, that is a layer of, again, an ism that's falling into place. So we want to be careful about, counter stereotypic imaging really requires us to intentionally replace positive images to counteract the negative images that we are usually bombarded with. But we have to make sure that we are mindful about that not being an exception to the norm in our own brain. And that part is something that needs to be worked on for us.
I totally agree with you, Deij. I feel like to me, the way I kind of like have this short description of that in my head is that, for example, like with disability, like, you know, not just saying that, oh, disabled people can be exceptional, but exceptional people can be disabled.
Exactly.
You know, like having that, like the latter of which is a much better way of framing that versus the first part, which is feeding into what Deij was saying, which is that, oh, because this person has this and if they're able to do that, they're exceptional. Like, no, they're an exceptional person. They just also happen to be disabled. That's very much the case for people like Harriet Tubman and for Frida Kahlo. And so is there any other like pictures, photos, or symbols or things that you think you guys could put in your office spaces or your home or things to counter negative stereotypes about communities that you serve? Things that you could make salient for people so that way they could look at that and be like, oh, this isn't as negative of a thing as they thought it was.
Painting.
Paintings, yeah,
Yes, perfect example.
absolutely.
And we'll talk
yeah.
about that later.
Yeah.
This might sound silly, but I saw a Ken doll in a wheelchair.
Mhm.
in the
Yeah.
bar- I
That's-
thought, how wonderful to have that in the waiting room instead of
Yes.
trucks and books.
Yes, that's a great, and it sounds silly, but it's when you think about, I mean, what year it is and how long it takes for like dolls like that to be made, like it's not, like it is such an important and great thing for kids to look at, or even adults too, like to feel like, you know, looking at something and feeling represented in that. That's not silly, that's a very empowering thing, but it can feel that way for sure, just on the
Yeah.
surface of it.
Absolutely. Yep, go ahead.
We've been trying to be mindful of printing out like.
Can you grab the mic so that they can, yeah.
We've been trying to be mindful of printing Christmas things that aren't just like a Christian Christmas, but they represent, you know, different ethnicities and nationalities and religions, and also printing like Santas of different colors.
Yeah.
So that's more like the
Yeah.
ritual.
Absolutely. Yeah, representation matters, right?
Right,
Yeah,
because that
100%.
is a really good point, really, because I feel like the thing is like if you put too much of one type of picture or symbol in a place, you're really putting that one above all others. And so
Yeah.
I really like the idea of having all these different type of ones that are salient and accessible so that they're not being seen as put on one pedestal or another or vice versa. That's a really
Yeah.
good point.
I think that, you know, the main thing is that if we have developed our implicit biases are, let's say, one of the biggest driver for our implicit biases, like we talked about, is our lived experiences and things that we are exposed to on a day-to-day basis, right? Like what everything around us looks like, sounds like, feels like about a particular thing is what our implicit biases are, you know, going to gravitate towards, or that's how they're formed. So I think an aspect to this counter stereotypic imaging is that if predominantly, let's say, the able-bodied white male straight narrative is the one that is considered the predominant culture or the predominant image and the messaging that's there, that's considered, white is good, kind of a theme that we've been fed over and over and over for so many generations. I think we have to start somewhere. We can potentially start shifting those biases in a more equitable way by flooding our surroundings and our environment with more representational images and messages, right? So if it can swing that one way, it can swing the other way too, but we have to be intentional and mindful about what we are surrounding ourselves with. All right. So this is just something for you guys to think about. If this is a strategy you're going to use, to be really mindful about including more symbols and pictures and photos and books and things like that, that you have access to and that people around you can see very clearly as well. All right, the next strategy we're going to talk about is individuation. And this one is, instead of relying on group-based attributes or group-based attitudes or what you know about a specific group, getting to know people from that group individually as people, getting to know individuals for who they are versus just their affinity with a particular group or identity is helpful, right? And so when you obtain specific information about group members, it helps prevent us from making those stereotypical conclusions or jumping to conclusions or arriving at, those first impressions the way we think of as because they belong to a certain group. And it helps us evaluate different members of different groups based on their own individual characteristics rather than just the fact that they belong to this, to a group. For example, deafness, right? There are individuals in the deaf community who view deafness as an identity, and they don't want to seek cures for the deafness or accommodations for it, right? They have their own language, they have their own world, they have their own identity, and they feel very, very strongly and passionately about that identity. Whereas there are others who belong to the deaf community who do seek interventions such as cochlear implants or other interventions to help them be more hearing. And so when we want to make sure that, how can we use this individuation as a strategy to combat certain stereotypes or implicit biases that we may hold about the deaf community, for example. So just something to think about. So this just kind of highlights how not to make broad assumptions about individual people based on just group affiliations or identity affiliations. Make sense? I think the other strategy to do that comes under the way to kind of promote individuation as a strategy would be to ally yourself with groups advocating. We're talking about disability today, who are, who speak and advocate with and for disabled people, right? And so ally yourself or affiliate yourself with groups that you are prone to be biased against, whether it's race or ethnicity or gender identity or disability status, belonging to a group you're prone to be biased against, and, seek out members who have lived experiences that are different than your own so that your perspective broadens. Within Cincinnati, there are groups that we would like to highlight, like, Our Tribe or Autism and We, the Spina Bifida Coalition, and, aligning yourselves or, getting familiar with these groups, interacting with members from those groups will help you kind of see how community members from those groups describe themselves, how do they advocate for themselves, and what are the ways that they would like to be seen in the larger society. And that would also help you gain more perspective about that.
Okay, so this next one that we'll talk about are perspective taking. So that involves, like it already says, taking the perspective in the first person of a member of a stereotype group while challenging our own biases and fostering empathy. So it is just it's the quite literal implementation of the phrase, putting yourself in another person's shoes. So what this does, though, is by doing that, you increase psychological closeness to the stigmatized group, whichever group you're taking the perspective of, and that helps ameliorate or just diminish automatic group-based evaluations, like the ones that might have shown in the results that were given to you from your IAT. And so what are some creative and respectful ways that you all can think of to experience the perspective of a member of a stereotyped or marginalized group? Some of them were already said before, like, for example, Maddie had said paintings. Looking into a painting of a person with a disability is a great window into their thought process and the things that motivate them or things that mean something to them. So that would be one example. Is there any other examples you guys could think of?
Go ahead.
I was gonna say like art or literature.
Art or literature, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, books as well, especially like what we did at the beginning of the year. We each had to read a book from the perspective of a person with a disability or someone affiliated with a person with a disability. Very important to understanding that perspective. Any other type of examples?
Just talking to people that are part of that group. And hearing
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Mass media is a great way, a very impactful way. So having maybe a movie to the perspective of someone with a disability.
Yeah, watching a movie or
Disability on the writing team.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, watching movies or shows that are created by individuals with disability, or at least those who have a strong voice in that creation process, for sure. Absolutely. Any other ideas? Yes.
I think like attending talks, so like Children's Hospital has a lot of really great forums that you can log on to.
Yeah.
And I've done that and gotten a really good perspective from people who are different than me. And then also like the social work group specifically here at Children's Hospital has a really good like ally and inclusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think like attending their talks as well.
Yeah. Yes.
for those that are doing that community-based projects, but like even volunteering with different organizations or being like spending one-on-one time with someone with a disability in not necessarily an isolated setting, but more of a community setting. So you're really seeing the impact that that individual experiences on a day-to-day basis.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I don't know if everybody in Zoom line could hear that, but volunteering in the community and being part of groups that work with individuals in the community that are part of a certain group can also help increase that perspective taking. Absolutely. Other thoughts before we move on? Yes.
Watching YouTube videos of celebrity singers have disabilities.
Absolutely. Watching influencers, right? People that are in the public eye have so much say and so much sway over us, and and they help normalize so many things for us, right? And so absolutely having those representatives and supporting those artists who are in the public eye and watching them and learning from them is another powerful way. Thank you. Yeah.
I think too, like going off what Maddie said, like with YouTube, social media in general is a really great place for people with disabilities to elevate their own voices, and for other people who are allies to access their, like what are their like, they do like blogging or like showing it like a day in the life of, like those type of things. Those type of videos and things like that are so beneficial for perspective taking and really understanding what it's like to live with the experience of a person with a disability. Okay.
Great thoughts here.
Yeah. So we're gonna go ahead and practice some perspective taking. Hopefully you all are able to see this painting pretty well on the slide. But just so if you guys are able to see it, what do you all think this painting is about? Obviously it's a Frida Kahlo, but I won't give you any more details than that for right now. But what are some of the things that are standing out to you in this painting?
Someone in a wheelchair.
Yes, it's someone in a wheelchair.
Someone in a wheelchair.
Yeah. What is she holding?
She's the artist, isn't she?
Yes. Well, what is she holding in her hands?
Somebody said a heart. Okay.
A heart. Okay.
Flowers. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
So
so
we-
why would she be holding a heart?
Maybe the painting is of someone she like lost, like maybe it's out of grief.
Okay. Maybe it's a
Okay.
painting of someone she's lost and it's a painting of grief. Okay.
Okay. So who do you think that person that she's painting, who do you think that person is in relation to her? Just why? And I know that you guys maybe have never seen this painting before, so you're just making wild guesses, and that's totally okay. That's what this is
Okay.
about.
We have her father as one response. What
Okay.
what are some other guesses?
Husband, I saw in the chat. Granddad.
Okay, her granddad. Okay.
Okay.
What's that? A brother. Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'll go ahead and I'll just spill the beans of what this painting is. And so this is a self-portrait of Frida Kahlo, where she is painting herself, making a portrait of her doctor, Dr. Farrell. And so for anyone who doesn't know the history of Frida Kahlo, not only was she likely born with spina bifida, but she actually had a really bad bus accident in a trolley that led her to having several back surgeries throughout her whole life. In fact, Dr. Farrell, the person in this painting, performed 7 surgeries on her spine in 1951 alone, and she had to stay in the hospital in Mexico City for 9 months. And then in November of 1951, she was finally able to paint again, and this was the first painting that she did. And the painting was titled Self-Portrait with the Portrait of Dr. Farrell. And she wrote in her diary, "I was sick for a year, 7 operations on my spine. Dr. Farrell saved me." And so in this portrait, you see Frida sitting in a wheelchair, holding her heart palette in one hand and brushes in another, implying that she painted using basically her heart and the love that she has for her doctor who saved her. And so some information about the type of style of this portrait is that it is called ex votos, which is a Latin term that means for solemn vow or promise. And so an ex votos painting typically has three elements. One, a scene depicting a grave tragedy or someone with a grave illness or injury. Two, a depiction of the intervention of a saint on behalf of the afflicted. And three, an inscription describing the tragic event that gives thanks for the divine intervention. And so one of the many things I love about Frida Kahlo is she takes these type of things and flips them on their head. So what she does is, instead of depicting some type of angelic intervention to what attributes to her being able to move around again, is that she's depicting her surgeon as the saint who intervened and credited him for his talents and commitment to helping her. And then also, she's not depicting her disability in this painting as a grave condition or tragedy. Instead, it's pictured as a disabled woman doing what she loves, thanks to Dr. Farrell, who helped make it happen. And the reason I show this painting is because I think it's very important for us as people who are going to be healthcare providers serving people with disabilities, is that this is something that, like, we have the privilege and ability to do. Like, we are very much in a position to help people like Frida, who maybe go months without being able to walk very well, or have very severe mental health issues or things like that, that maybe until our intervention, those things were not possible. And so really, I guess all this is just trying to say is that I think it's really, and also, again, putting the thing on its head that like the whole divine intervention thing, like not necessarily that we are gods or anything like that, but that we have the ability to make a difference in these people's lives, and that hopefully if we do it in the right way, that thankfulness and respect will be given back. And I think that's just really great and awesome. So there's a lot of paintings that Frida does depicting her disability and her emotions with that. And so if you're ever interested, I would definitely encourage you all to look them up. Any thoughts about the painting now that I've kind of uncovered more about what it's about? What are you all thinking and feeling about it?
Yeah. Sarah, did you have something?
Yeah.
You want to use the mic so that the Zoom folks can hear you as well?
Yeah, I only my I'm
Yes, I can hear you. Can you guys hear her, Simon?
I think so.
It's on. Okay.
yeah, I'm 25 years. I haven't witnessed the power of my providers haven't been without them. There's no way I would be here now.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. I mean, there is no denying that each of us, regardless of what we do, have an impact on people that we meet, right? Like not just, especially so in our profession, but in just day-to-day life. And we have the power to choose what kind of impact we have on them, right? So the impact we have on people is undeniable, right? Like all of us have an impact on everybody that we meet, but we really have the power to choose what impact we have on people. And exercises like the ones we are engaging in now are absolutely essential to that, to ensuring that the impact that we have on others tends to be more positive than negative, right? Or is something that, and when you are in a position where you can use the tools that we have, our cognitive facilities, our resources that we have, to become more self-reflective, to become more mindful, to become more aware and more committed to creating more diversity and equity and inclusive societies, that's what we should be spending our time doing. Absolutely. Right. Any other thoughts before we move on? Really good discussion, you guys. Great job. All right. Anything from Zoom land?
I don't think so. I think we can go ahead and move on.
All right, so this final strategy that we are talking, I think this is the final strategy, but yes, it is. The final strategy we are talking about is very much in alignment or a continuation really of the previous one, the perspective taking. Really one of the straightforward ways to ensure more perspective taking is really finding ways to increase opportunities for contact with the groups that we are, we hold prejudices against or biases against, or groups that don't share our lived experiences. So find ways to seek out opportunities to encounter and engage with out group members, right? Members that have different life experiences and lived experiences and identities that you do, so that you can help us, so that you can develop a better understanding and a broader perspective of what someone from a marginalized or an outside group might feel like to you, and they can develop a better understanding of who you are and where you come from as well. And that leads to more opportunities, leads to more opportunities for dialogue as well, and learning from each other. And so what do you guys think? How can we create opportunities for meaningful contact with disabled members of our community outside of our professional role, right? Like, this is what we all do day to day in terms of work for many of us. Many of us have, personal and lived experiences of, having a disability or knowing and loving people with disabilities. What else can we do outside of these immediate systems that we have, these microsystems that we have where we are exposed to this? Yeah.
Okay, volunteering.
Volunteering, yeah. Yep. Any other thoughts? What other ways, like, outside of professional roles, personal, what are some other ways to engage with the broader community, with people with disabilities, and with, any other kind of marginalized groups that you are not a part of?
Volunteer work.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Volunteering is a definite, is one of the most accessible ways to gain belonging or entry to a group, for sure. Yep.
Having opportunity for disabled individuals and their families to like participate and like give feedback in certain areas. So like we have the DWP Family Advisory Council, which is great, and it touches like really a small portion. I think we need a disabled advisory council just in general to touch more things, but
100%.
without having those opportunities like for those contacts and reflection within that area, I think we need more of those opportunities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great point. Did you have your hand up over there in the corner? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, general inclusivity. I think from a higher, like a privileged position, like a lot of us are with non-disabled people, just advocacy for people with disabilities, and like meaningful inclusivity just reminds me of our one of our LEND projects is to make like summer camps or day camps accessible for kids with disabilities, and just educating other people that maybe don't have the opportunity to interact with this group as much, so that we can kind of change their perspectives. I think I need to be done.
Fantastic. Great points. Yep. Leveraging your privilege to make meaningful changes and advocacy. Yep.
I was going to say something very similar, and just like go out to community events and go to certain events that are going on, and just be there.
Yeah, involve yourself, right? And I really love how you brought up the Family Advisory Council, like really seeking input from members of the community that we are trying to serve, right? And a lot of times, we offer, we are committed to evidence-based practice. We rely heavily on what the data suggests, what evidence suggests, what what science tells us, and that is the way things, that should be our driver, but it can't just stop there, right? Like, I think that we need to do that additional, take that extra step and go the additional mile to say, okay, this is what I know from what I've learned and read and researched, but tell me, does this apply to you in this immediate community? And how am I still speaking the language that makes sense to you? Am I still serving the needs that would be relevant to this community right here? So absolutely kind of seeking input and asking to learn, not, asking to respond, like Simon said before, I think is definitely a way to go. Other thoughts on this, either from Zoom land or from any of you guys? All right, so here are some other examples, like creating and joining a dialogue group, like very similar to what you guys were talking about. Again, one of the few ways that social media is helpful, right? And like to find online communities, online shared communities, support groups, advocacy groups, things like that is always a great way to, even if we don't have, a lot of times in positions of, if we have privileges that that another group might not, I think just even being part of these groups to listen and understand, not necessarily to contribute or to tell them what you think, but really just listening and understanding can go a long way in that perspective building. And the National Park Service, Allies for the Inclusion program, they train staff to be dialogue facilitators, and to do that, they use 60 to 90-minute monthly like brown bag lunches as a strategy to encourage that increased contact and to encourage dialogues and ways for them to facilitate these conversations. So if it is a possibility in your groups, in your disciplines, in your divisions, to have those kinds of monthly meetings or brown bag lunches, even every couple of times a quarter, like those things could go a long way in understanding perspectives and facilitating contact. All right, so as we wrap up, which of these strategies do you guys think you'll use going forward in terms of, where you might be like, okay, I've kind of identified, there has been a situation where I've identified an internal bias that I've had that's influenced an interaction that I've had, either in person, online, via email, doesn't matter, in your personal life, professional life, doesn't matter. What do you think, which of these strategies speak most to you in terms of addressing the implicit biases that you might have? Yeah, go ahead. Stereotype replacement. Yeah. Yep. Anyone else? Yeah.
Like probably perspective taking, and I think it's a little bit of like a lower barrier to entry, but I think that is something that I often find.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I agree with Bradley on the perspective taking, but increasing the opportunities, I think that's part, like, in everyone's life of having the time and taking the time.
Yeah.
Needs to be a better priority for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you need to get creative about ways to improve or increase your access to the groups that you want to understand better. Right? Yeah. Anyone else? Anybody on Zoom that would like to contribute? Finally, like if you just look at the strategies and just it almost like ideally it would work. It can work either way, right? Like the more you increase contact, the better your perspective taking becomes, and you have more of an opportunity to be individualized to that person and use individuation which then can lead to that stereotype replacement in many ways, is oftentimes a final step, right? Once you've had the opportunity to increase your contact with the group and get to know people in that group and get to learn their perspectives. But it can, in the absence of access to large groups and times and things like that, absolutely seeking out opportunities where you can engage in self-growth through literature and art and listening to talks and watching shows and supporting artists and other people belonging to groups, volunteering, having more counter stereotypical images in your day-to-day life at work and at home, things like that. All of those things definitely contribute to this.
I really like how you said that, Deij, about how, like it's almost like some of these could be seen as like step by step, like perspective taking would probably be like a level 1, like Bradley's saying. Like it's not it is like a lower barrier for entry, but at the same time, I feel like that's not like, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It means that it's something that you can do a lot. I mean, perspective taking, every time we do this training, it seems like perspective taking always does seem to be the more popular one, but I think that's for good reason. I think it's one of the lower entry barrier ones, and then also it allows for a really rich discussion and insight about like those lived experiences and things like that.
Yeah, I also think that that's one of the things that feels very much in our control, right? I think, increasing opportunities for contact is ideal, but it may not always be possible based on where you live and who you are and what life looks like for you and what the community looks like for you. But perspective taking is a very volitional action that you can take where you're making an intentional decision about like, okay, let me reflect on what it might be like to be in their shoes and what can I do? How can I see this differently? What can I do to assume positive intent? All of those things that we have control over for sure.
Yeah, so these are just some resources that we have if you want to continue learning about implicit bias. We have them separated as to read, watch, listen. So the read are some books that you can check out on Amazon. The watch is some YouTube videos that are available, and I did include this therapist reacting to implicit bias in Zootopia as a way to talk about implicit bias with kids. I think Zootopia is like a perfect implicit bias 101 for that kind of thing. And then listening, we have some podcasts on there as well. So thank you guys all so much for attending the presentation. Go ahead.
There is also Raz on Zoom did suggest a YouTube channel called Special Books for Special Kids that interviews children and adults with disabilities and to get more perspective. So thank you, Raz, for sharing that. That is a really nice resource that you've pointed us to. I'd also encourage people, I personally am a big fan of comedy, and a lot of times are hard to digest topics like bias and prejudice and any ism, I feel gets much more palatable when it's delivered with humor. And so there are lots and lots of really great stand-up acts, for example, and, shows that, we can watch a bit. We'll see if we can put together a list of some of those resources as well, but things like that as well help with the perspective taking, as well as challenging some of the stereotypes we all grow up with.
I will ask for any last minute questions or comments, but I also just want to let everyone know that we do need to get feedback on our presentations for the CCHMC DEI office and our own grant foundation that supplies us with the opportunity to lead these trainings. So I will be sending a link to Sarah and Steph for them to blast out through the Canvas. And if you all could just please take that survey. The responses are anonymous, so feel free to roast us as much as you want, or if we did a great job, let us know about that too. All feedback is welcome. We just want to make sure we're doing the best job that we can of educating everybody about this stuff. So we really appreciate any feedback that you guys are willing to give.
Yes, I'll reiterate that. If you can take a few minutes to give us feedback, that would be wonderful, and it'll help us continue to develop and refine this training for future classes and audiences. So thank you guys so much. You guys were fantastic and really, really participated very well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Appreciate it. Did I end this, Simon?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you end it or if Sarah does. I don't know if it matters.
I'll let Sarah do it. All right.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, thanks, Simon.
No problem. See ya.
And then you're not